A chilly, pitch-dark autumn night at the end of the 18th century, somewhere on the wild shores of Lake Kostor, on the land occupied by the Ottoman Empire. 200 Christians are walking in a tight column. They only have their flaming torches and the half moon to light their way along the thorny track. They've been walking like this for a whole week and have at least another 10 days and nights travel ahead of them, if by chance they're not suddenly robbed and beaten by Haiduti, the sinister Balkan paramilitary squads. These poor wanderers are no soldiers, they're refugees. Most of them are women, children and elderly people. Men of active age are the least in number. They're each carrying whatever they can. This is all the property they have. They're still in good spirits. These are the first 30 families of about 150 who would leave their homes forever, heading for Bratsigovo. Although for the first time they're on their way back to the heart of their mother country in the region of Thrace, near the Balkan Mountains, after which the Balkan Peninsula is named. Most of these people would manage to get there alive, but in pretty poor health. Later, the 3.5 centuries old mythology of the Bratsigovo families would begin. As with the legends about some of the most beautiful buildings in Bulgaria. In the 9th century AD, Bulgaria was one of the only 3 states in Europe, along with Byzantium and the Frankish Empire. It has now existed for over 1,300 years. The history of the master builders of Bratsigovo begins at the end of the 18th century. They were subjects of the enormous Ottoman Empire. At the time, it extended from what is now Tunisia to northern Moldova, from Bosnia to Kuwait on the Persian Gulf, and from southern Egypt along the River Nile to Yemen on the Red Sea. It was similar in scale to the Roman Empire. The Ottoman Empire was governed by the reform-minded Sultan Selim III. But his efforts were thwarted by Islamic clerics and the fanatical Janissary court. His empire began to fall apart. Despotism and lawlessness spread in various places around the enormous empire. One of these places was Moskopole in what is now Albania. Banditism began to masquerade as religion. As usually happens, criminals used the name of some god as a pretext for their ill treatment of believers in another god. Others lost all they had, their homes and their lands, not due to crime, but to the constant increases in taxation. As a result, they formed new disadvantaged social categories. The most talented and the poorest in this Eastern-style bourgeois environment were the builders, craftsmen who built entire towns. Their architecture could be found in the Ottoman Empire. But most of the buildings closely resemble those in nearby Italy, about 100 kilometers across the Adriatic Sea. Most of the builders went to work there frequently, and they were well acquainted with Renaissance architectural forms. So what did they find when they arrived in Bratsigovo? Narrow, muddy streets, low houses with ramshackle arches and wooden stakes, and single-story hovels dug into the ground. The link with medieval building practices, strongly influenced by the Eastern Roman Empire, was forcibly broken 4 centuries earlier by the Ottomans.
With their hard work, skills and talent, these refugee builders would turn the cycle of history in the most inexorable and effective way through architecture. Ancient Greece has always been at the foundation of European civilization.
However, with its decline and the westward cultural shift, initially to Rome, it seemed that it would never come back to the Balkans where it began. Yes, but architecture goes by its own laws. Even at the beginning of the Renaissance, townhouses became symbols of their owners' idea of prosperity and prestige. Initially during the 15th century in Italy, then in the 16th century in the Netherlands, and the 17th century in the Austro-Hungarian Empire. At that time, architecture in the Ottoman Empire was very different. It was based on the Byzantine heritage and on models from the Emirates of Asia Minor. This architecture was characterized by mosques, educational institutions or madrasas, covered and open markets, bathhouses, and inns with central courtyards or caravanseries. But residential homes were still small and dark inside, as in medieval times. Large townhouses were a purely bourgeois model for independent people. The builders who arrived in Bratsigovo at the end of the 18th century unwittingly brought this ideology with them. This was the beginning of the still unrecognized Balkan rebellion against the Ottoman Empire, contemporary Europe against the enormous Eastern Empire which almost conquered it 2 centuries previously. Bratsigovo, the beginning of the 1790s. Most of the 150 families travelling the Kostur, Tikvesh, Nevrkop, Gotsidelchev, Kovacevica, Krichim route arrived in the town. Tatar Pazardjik, the provincial governor or bey of the nearest large district, had already authorized their settlement here. What was more difficult was the relations between the local Bulgarians and the newcomers. The locals were referred to as mrvaks, from the old word mrva meaning coal ash. The men mostly worked in rudimentary coal mines or as cartwrights. They were tall, heavily built, and not very friendly. By the 19th century, the word mrvak had gradually become an overt insult. The newcomers were called Arnuti, the Greek name for Albanian mercenaries at the time of the Neapolitan Kingdom under Charles of Anjou. For decades, the two social strata lived completely separately one from the other, even refusing to speak to each other. They spoke different languages. They wore different dress. The Mrvaks wore traditional dress, while the Arnuti wore the clothing of the Kostor area. They turned their heads away when they passed each other. The Arnuti soon began building work. They applied all the experience they had acquired during the hard existence they had lived previously. They began to build houses resembling small 2 or 3-story fortresses, located close to each other, with narrow corner windows and real loopholes from which it was easy to shoot relentlessly at any invading enemies. At the beginning of the 19th century, Bratsigovo looked completely different. There were cobbled streets, stone bridges over the river Ulmishka, and spacious houses with covered balconies. Although the financial means of the Arnuti were still very limited, they began to alter the economic situation in Bratsigovo. Here was where the building was going on. Some of the wealthier inhabitants got together. The builders helped anyone wanting to settle in the town, providing labour and materials. The town grew. There was a kind of enlightenment, as if they had relit the flaming torches with which they had come. Most of them settled in Bratsigovo. Others settled in small surrounding villages, such as Pataljanica, Debrashtica and Srancha. Gradually, they would also move to prosperous Bratsigovo. the Bratsigovo builders started construction works around the region in Plovdiv, Pazardjik, Karlovo, Peštera, Batak. As time went on, their work took them as far as Sofia. They also built water mills, sawmills, leather tanneries, drinking fountains and other structures. The 1830s. By now there were quite a few mixed marriages between Marvaks and Arnuti. The population was about 5,000, as many as in contemporary Sozopol on the Black Sea, and almost as many as in Malta's capital Valletta. Almost all of the Arnuti's children went to school and could read and write. Their fathers worked for long periods abroad, usually from springtime to late autumn. The women looked after the households. They dealt with the authorities and protected the interests of their families and the community. The role acquired by the women of Bratsigovo was remarkable for its time and for the country. They even began to make business decisions, which is unthinkable in some places in parts of the Orient, even today. Several types of trade were now flourishing in Bratsigovo. Coopers, carpenters, builders and potters. They had formed about 10 craftsmen's guilds. Each had its own rules and regulations, often more effectively enforced than the laws of the state. The builders assembled in gangs to go to work abroad. These groups each comprised 20 to 30 people in a strict hierarchy. The master builders headed the gangs.
Така е устава. А който не се подчинява на този ред, майсторите имат разрешение от еснафа да го бият и да го затварят. That's how the statutes sounded in archaic Bulgarian.
At the time, Bratsigovo was already a kind of logistical centre for other large towns with active construction sectors. Apprentices and novices from hundreds of kilometres away, in the Lovich, Turnovo and Ruse regions, arrived here, only to set out on the road again. Being a member of this particular guild was a guarantee of getting work, prestige and often more money. But some of the newcomers encountered an unexpected difficulty. They could understand nothing or very little of the way their colleagues spoke. The problem wasn't their accent or dialect. When the craftsmen got together, even their own relatives couldn't understand them. What had happened? In Britain, at the beginning of the 18th century, guilds were being established in a manner reminiscent of the caste system. Most of their members were decisive, intelligent men, builders with sound architectural knowledge. They worked hard, drank heavily, and frequently got into fights. They organised themselves in lodges. In the Goose and Gridiron pub in London on the 24th of June 1717, 4 English lodges of Freemasons united as the Grand Lodge of England.
This is considered to be the date of birth of one of the most influential and mystical societies in the world, which has survived until the present day, the Freemasons. Inevitably, the Brotherhood would create its own secret cant and rituals.
In full awareness, the Bratsigovo builders did something similar when they settled in the town. For centuries until the present day, the local population has used Italian and Greek words that are absent from Slavonic languages. But the builders didn't only use foreign words. They even distorted Bulgarian words into sentences that were totally incomprehensible, even to the local teacher or priest. They even invented their own signs. They call this language Mishtrovsky, from the Bulgarian word for a master builder. Newcomers to the guild had to swear not to disclose this secret vernacular, and the master builders knew that they wouldn't. No wonder. USA, 1826. Captain William Morgan applied unsuccessfully to join the Masons. He later wrote a highly compromising book about the secrets of the Masons, full of authentic details. Shortly afterwards, he was kidnapped, together with Miller, his publisher. The captain was ostentatiously killed, but the publisher managed to get away. The whole world read about the drama. The news reached as far as the Ottoman Empire. The analogy was clear even to the youngsters. The Bratsigovo builders were the Freemasons of Bulgaria. Nobody should mess with them for fear of retribution. Many of these uncompromising men wore medals handed to them personally by the Turkish Sultan for building some of the most strategic fortresses in the empire. Benefiting from these merits in the eyes of the supreme authorities, they managed to obtain permission to protect themselves to the death from bands of raiders, even Muslims. The historical paradox is that they didn't manage to achieve this in their own prosperous localities. But by now the Ottoman Empire had begun its inexorable disintegration. When Irish and Scottish Masons set out around Europe creating their rituals, it was clear that this would continue for decades. Aging fathers began to initiate their grown sons in the trade and in a parallel existence. The same thing happened in Bratsigovo. From then until the present day, for a quarter of a millennium, family names such as Boyanin, Gulemetovi, Ajikski, Terzikini and Turpomanovi have prospered in this town. The first major construction project to establish the reputation of the builders was the solid bridge built in 1793 over the river Maritsa when it was in spate. The master builders who had settled until this moment were clever enough to join forces and carry out the project for no personal gain. The project was assigned to them personally by the regional governor, Tatar Pazardjik Gavanazolu. Firstly, they made accurate measurements of the flow of the river. Then they determined exactly where the bridge should be placed. They decided that it shouldn't be made entirely of stone, because sooner or later the turbulent water would wash it away anyway. They built a stone foundation, but made the walkway out of wood so that it could be replaced at any time.
The solution was a masterpiece. The Bratsigovo builders had become celebrities of their age and their country, much like contemporary architects such as Norman Foster.
They strutted around the inns and hostelries, attracting universal admiration for their talk of the grandiose projects they would build in person. This was no exaggeration. In the mornings, their listeners from the previous evening would roll out of their barns light-headed from cheap wine, while the Bulgarian masons set out for yet another building site, almost always putting up a building that would make its mark in Balkan history. The end of the 19th century. Amid the confusion in Bulgaria, newly liberated from 5 centuries of Ottoman domination, not a single one of the Bratsigovo builders' plans or blueprints was preserved. It is likely that the last documents from this time disappeared in a rather unfortunate manner. After the death of one of the elder master builders, his son-in-law sold the precious oriental boxes in which he kept his blueprints to an antique dealer. He gave the useless rice paper to his children. They folded it up to make little boats. These little boats probably returned together with their grandfather's ghost to his origins in Dubrovnik or Genoa. Perhaps this is the origin of the myth that the Bratsigovo builders never used plans or blueprints, only working from some kind of engineering plan in their heads. rather like playing chess blind against numerous opponents. The intellectual effort of building without plans would have been just like that. Some of these builders spoke 5 or 6 languages perfectly, but could not write in any of them. A similar skill to building without plans. During the first half of the 19th century, the Ottoman Empire was no longer the powerful, inexorable force that seemed like nothing could stop it. It was already called the sick man of Europe. In 1829, the Treaty of Edirne was signed, following Russia's victory in the Russo-Turkish War. The integrity of the empire was under threat. But in order to undermine Russian influence in the Balkans, England and France forced the indecisive Sultan Abdul-Mejid to carry out reforms in the empire, to guarantee the life, property and dignity of all peoples, to ensure equal rights of Christians and Muslims, and to introduce a judicial system similar to the one in Europe. The Sultan read the proclamation out loud in the Rose Pavilion in his palace. That moment heralded the feverish construction of Orthodox churches in the Balkans. When they first invaded the Balkans in the 14th century, the Ottomans almost completely destroyed Bulgaria's royal medieval architecture. Palaces, churches and townhouses. Only a few of the more impressive ones were converted into mosques. Exactly the same as what happened to the most splendid places of worship after the invasion of Constantinople, or Tsarigrad as the Bulgarians called it from that moment onwards. 4.5 centuries later, everything had to start again from scratch. This was no easy task. Despite the seemingly liberal reforms, the builders and believers encountered considerable obstacles. According to the authorities, there were no bureaucratic obstacles to building Christian churches. But everywhere the local Muslims rose up in protest against the new religious buildings. The Christians came out the worst from this acute religious conflict. The Bratsigovo builders knew this. They advised local Bulgarian leaders to accept the condition imposed by the Beys for churches not to exceed a particular height. In particular, not to exceed the height of a single mosque. They began to dig their buildings into the ground, even 1.5 meters down. This didn't restrict the available space, or the number of believers who could gather inside. For the Bulgarian nation undergoing a revival at that time, solidarity and empathy were paramount. But the builders wouldn't miss the opportunity to demonstrate their virtuosity and even greatness, despite the restrictions. Places of worship were the most suitable for this purpose. But despite the pogroms of the 14th century, they didn't need to start the buildings completely from scratch. They based their buildings on architectural models preserved from the end of the 9th and 10th centuries, just after Bulgaria adopted Christianity. At that time, the rulers of Bulgaria were quick to adopt and sometimes further develop models from the Eastern Roman Empire, which scholars would later refer to as Byzantium. Early Christians further developed the basilica, originally a Roman public building. They turned it into a special church for conducting particular rituals. One of these was the grand 9th century basilica in Pliska, the capital of the first Bulgarian state. With a few exceptions, church construction in what was then Bulgaria didn't begin until the middle of the 18th century. The Bratsigovo builders occupied a special place in the whole architectural process. They were not the only ones, but they were unsurpassed in some respects. The quality of their stonework was exceptional, and they built spacious rooms with considerable panache. They mastered interior light and shade, manipulating volumes and spaces. They introduced oval and deliberately unfinished elements. This deformed pearl is a typical highly developed technique, now a byword for European Baroque. They named it after the shape of the asymmetrical pearls that were so highly valued by the pretentiously rich. They used the trompe-l'œil technique, altering the perspective so that the human eye perceives the images and spaces as three-dimensional. But this only began to take place after the 1830s. Religious buildings at the end of the 17th century were still small, dark and primitively designed. The achievement was to replace the old wooden and mud-built churches with stone or brick. One of the first churches where the old traditions were revived is the Sveta Nedelya church in the town of Batak. Its domes and arches were now made of stone, but it was still very small in relation to what was coming. Particular architectural details appear small and ungainly. The year is 1813. The next step in the stylistic development is the St. Dimitar Church in Peshtere.
Strict geometrical relationships were becoming established. The external outline of the church is a rectangle.
Remember that they had to be careful not to challenge the assertion of superiority stipulated by the oppressor. In the event of infringement, all their hard work would be reduced to ashes and dust.
It contains two equilateral triangles, each side equal to the width of the church.
The pseudo-basilica model would from now on be reproduced in various versions and styles. The pseudo-basilica reproduces the characteristic central nave and two aisles of the classic basilica, but instead of a raised central nave, it is level with the aisles. Inside, however, the pseudo-basilica would provide enough space if it was built by able craftsmen. Here it fulfills the role of a basilica, accommodating enough believers, but inducing a feeling of submission to the kingdom of heaven. Over about 1 year, the Bratsigovo builders, led by Nase the Pot, built one of the symbols of the town, the Church of St. John the Precursor. With its two domes, it would remain one of the very few for decades to come. The style of this architectural solution was astonishing. The domes rest on two symmetrical groups of 4 columns. The width of the squares formed by each of the two groups of 4 columns is equal to the width of the nave. The western facade is worth a look. The silhouette is full of diversity. The cornice at the top is slightly bent just over the middle window arch, to emphasize the vertical line of the western axis. This art had certainly been mastered. The master builder Nase invented a simple device to enhance the acoustics inside. Pots were built into the walls. In this way, the priests could even be heard by the people crowded in front of the church. This earned the builder the nickname the Pot. This was about the time when the practice of anonymous building ended. Every builder insisted on signing his work. A few decades later, even copyright disputes would arise. The Church of the Holy Virgin in Pazardjik is a masterpiece. The year was 1837. The recently completed church is a pseudo-basilica with a central nave and 2 lateral aisles. In terms of its composition, at the time there was nothing like it anywhere else in the world. Its facade is exceptionally smooth. It exerts a calming influence on the eye. This is typical for Renaissance buildings. The western and eastern sides are sterner and more stately in appearance, while the lateral arcades give a feeling of warmth. but the interior has pronounced Baroque characteristics.
The aisles and the central nave are united so closely that they seem to be a single unit. How's this done?
The aisles and the nave are covered with domes. If you stand right in the middle, the aisles and the nave appear to increase in height simultaneously in front of you. The central nave is wider, and its half-cylindrical vault is raised. The light enhances the effect of increasing height. The windows along the external longitudinal walls are arranged so that the light enters simultaneously through both lateral aisles, cuts through the volume of the columns, and brings the width of the common space together. In this way, the builder turned the interior of the pseudo-basilica into a basilica. The entire building is built symmetrically on an east-west axis. The exterior gives no clue to the magnificence awaiting us indoors, because the church is dug into the ground.
The semi-darkness inside prepares us for the grandeur of the impression made by the central part. This is achieved partly by raising the dome in an easterly direction. The impression is created by lowering the floor level. The gradient is unnoticeable because they put steps on 3 levels.
The passage to the iconostasis is completely smooth. This iconostasis is also emblematic for its time. It is the work of the Deber school of woodcarving and was finished years after the church was completed. The walls are faced with marble and pink rhyolite. Seemingly to perfect the impression of a masterpiece, the builder designed almost all architectural proportions according to the golden section.
This is the almost magical formula that combines art and geometry. The pyramids, the Parthenon, and Notre Dame Cathedral in Paris are all based on this formula. This is what it looks like.
At point B, a line is set up perpendicular to AB, and point C is defined on this line, so that BC is equal to half of AB. A circle is then inscribed, with its centre at point C and radius BC, intersecting AC at point D. Another circle is then inscribed with its centre at point A and radius AD, intersecting AB at point S. The golden section was devised by Leonardo da Vinci. It is now considered that the field of vision of the human eye is in proportion to a width of 16 units and a length of 9 units, which is almost equal to the golden section.
This is exactly why you're probably watching a screen in this format at the moment. Take a look at your remote control. It's probably got a button on it that turns the image format into 16 by 9. When you go into the church, look around for the effects created by the architect. Where the light comes from, the acoustics, where the dark places are, the way the building absorbs the sunlight from the outside, the place you enter, the way you move from one floor level to another. Oh, and who can watch you from above? Although the Church of the Holy Virgin in Pazardjik is still unsurpassed, the Bratsigovo school of master builders constructed numerous notable places of worship all over Bulgaria. One of them is St. Mary's Church in Plovdiv, a town considered by many scholars to be the most ancient European city in existence.
The church is located in the old part of the city, to the south of Taksim Hill. It was completed in 1851 at the beginning of Bulgaria's second great period of church independence. The central nave is even higher than in Pazardjik. The columns are also more slender and give the eye an even larger perspective. The light flows in from every corner. This is yet another step towards managing the space in the building. The Arnuti had not been settled in Bratsigovo for as much as a century, but had already set a standard for builders coming from all corners of the empire to learn their trade from them. They transmitted what they learned back to their hometowns and villages. Paradoxically, but exactly 2 generations after those dramatic torch-led journeys around Lake Kostur on their way to their new homeland, the art of their grandfathers turned around and went back. The style of the Bratsigovo builders spread back to the land that is now Macedonia and Albania. Yet again, architecture transmitted its influence in stone more easily than pollen from flowers. There is another Church of the Holy Virgin, which is important for the development of the Bratsigovo school of master builders. This one is located in the town of Kalofer. This church is the symbol of a new trend. The successful struggles for church independence and the increasing self-confidence of the nation initially led to a desire for ostentation. The Church of the Holy Virgin in Kalofer became something like a compound musical rhythm cast in stone, just like Bulgarian folklore from that period. The architectural rhythm leads us in perfect harmony through the semicircular wall alcoves, but with the window apertures remaining at different heights. The builder kept to his characteristic style when laying the basic stone material. The stone is worked and laid in regular order on the corners, while the foundation is rough like in a cave. The builder worked with colours and nuances in the plasterwork. This was not only an impulse to be ostentatious, but represented artistic extravagance. Only 25 years later, the Bulgarian people would be liberated. The first rebellion was initiated by master architects. Soon after these aesthetic struggles, the first gunshots would ring out. In their haste for freedom, Bulgarians confused art with rebellion. This was a tragedy. Many died, including master architects, especially in this region. But a little time remained until then. At this time, the Orthodox Christian Bratsigovo builders had acquired such popularity and respect that the Jewish and Catholic communities hired them to build their own places of worship. For the first time in the Ottoman Empire, the oppressed peoples showed mutual solidarity. They would no longer be oppressed. In the 1850s, they built a Catholic church in Plovdiv and a synagogue in Pazardjik. For a few decades, the popularity of St. Ludwig spilled out beyond the borders of Bulgaria. Its bells were donated by Pope Leo XIII. The synagogue is in exactly the same style as the school, but at the same time it meets the religious needs of the Jewish community in full. Sofia at the beginning of the 1860s. Only about 15 years later, the city would become the capital of the newly liberated independent Bulgarian state. The Bratsigovo builders completed the construction of the Sveta Nedelya church. Today, it is renowned far beyond the borders of Bulgaria. The remains of the Serbian king Stefan are preserved here, but it also has another claim to fame. In a cruel twist of fate, 2 remarkable churches made by the Bratsigovo builders, both bearing the name Sveta Nedelya, were turned into a worldwide symbol of human grief, suffering and horror. Batak at the beginning of May 1876. Bulgarians embarked on a reckless armed rebellion against the Ottoman Empire. It was mercilessly crushed. At the beginning of May, the churchyard and the church itself were crowded with desperate, inadequately armed men, women and children. They were surrounded by Bashi Buzuks, Turkish military units manned by Bulgarian Muslims. The attackers showed no mercy. Over 2,000 people were killed. After a visit here in August of that year, diplomats wrote in their report that the entire churchyard and the church building were choked with corpses, almost up to the level of the fence. The English diplomat Walter Baring wrote in his report, "Ahmed Aga and his men have earned the notoriety of committing perhaps the most heinous crime of our century." In other words, Bulgarians massacred Bulgarians. Sofia, 16th of April 1925. A funeral. The entire elite of the Bulgarian state had gathered in the cathedral, waiting for the Tsar. At this moment, there was a monstrous explosion. The building was almost completely destroyed. Under the ruins lay 193 dead and 500 injured. The attack was organized by the military wing of the Bulgarian Communist Party. Yet again, Bulgarians massacred other Bulgarians. This was the most bloody terrorist act in Europe until the explosion of the Pan Am Boeing above Lockerbie in 1988. The Bratsigovo builders skillfully put up other buildings and installations around the country. Schools, bridges and belfries. They were particularly well known for their bridge building, but in most cases it cannot be conclusively established who built them. It's now clear that they built the Dukov and Dragov bridges in Bratsigovo, the bridge in Pazardjik on the way to the village of Zvaničevo, and several others. But even the bridges around Bulgaria are not the most impressive buildings.
This isn't the case for belfries and clock towers. This is the bell tower of the Church of St. John the Precursor. A lot of architects and historians believe that this is the highest freestanding belfry on the Balkan Peninsula.
What is remarkable is that the bell is mounted on an independent wooden structure. This structure rests on the boundary between the stone and brick walls. So the brickwork only carries a frame-built dome. This is a clever invention to secure the vertical structure from powerful horizontal forces in the event of an earthquake. This was a particularly earthquake-prone area in the 19th and the beginning of the 20th century. But to this day, the structure has not sustained any damage. Along with churches, a major influence exerted by the Bratsigovo builders on the hearts and minds of Bulgarians was their work on schools and private homes. These are significant because the children's patriotic education and the bourgeois self-confidence arising from the fact that their parents owned their own homes generated a common national spirit. Not a single Turkish family ever lived in Bratsigovo. Most of the schools, however, were demolished as time went on. The surviving schools included the two in Bratsigovo and schools in Karlovo, in the village of Mechke in the Pazardjik region, and in the village of Golyamo Konare. These are not particularly significant from an architectural point of view.
They're built along the lines of the Baroque house in Plovdiv. It's got a splendid facade and a really stately interior.
The interior of the school is similar. The entrance hall is usually the main room, leading to rooms on both sides, and a staircase with 3 flights at the end. The commercial buildings were more interesting from an architectural point of view, but very few of them remain today. These were the buildings that gave the Bulgarian Charshia markets their characteristic style. The Bratsigovo builders erected houses from Bratsigovo through Karlovo and Plovdiv all the way to what is now Istanbul. The houses around Lake Ohrid are strongly reminiscent of those in Plovdiv and Bratsigovo. But this doesn't mean that the builders transmitted their Ohrid style wherever they settled.
It simply oozes various Mediterranean influences. The facades are interspersed with painted columns and have a lot of windows. The loggia leads through into a covered area called a kiosk.
The loggia was closed in the winter, but in the spring and summer, no one can persuade Mediterranean peoples not to have their midday meal outside, enjoying a view of the sea. You can find similar houses at the other end of the planet, in towns in the mountains of Indochina, formerly colonized by the French. Turkish influence abounds in the interior of houses built in the Bulgarian revival style. But this influence on the architecture is not definitive, as there are no separate rooms for men and women.
The house that belonged to the wealthy trader Nikolaki Christovich in Pazardjik is one of the most perfectly designed by the Bratsigovo master builders. Unusually for a private building as opposed to a church, no expense was spared on it.
Bulgarians were rarely able to invest unlimited funds in their private buildings, but they all gave as much money as they could for their churches. In Bratsigovo, a typical example of the way spaces can be brought together is the way the cellars are combined with premises for cultural activities in Vasil Petleshkov's house. The lower story seems to be more roughly built and has a commercial character, while the windows of the upper story are combined so as to give a hint of the purpose of the premises, a reading room. Vasil Petleshkov ran his own trading business since he was 20 years old. Shortly before his 30th birthday, he completed a 100-day course in pharmaceutics in what is now Istanbul. On his return, he set up a pharmacy on the first floor and built a cultural activities center on the second floor. He was the chairman of the center. He claimed that it provided the residents of Bratsigovo with both physical and spiritual treatment under one roof. It rapidly became very popular throughout the region. When the doomed April Rebellion broke out years later, he was selected as one of its leaders. He had no hesitation in accepting, although he knew that there was no going back. The slogan of the rebels was freedom or death. This was the end of property, the end of business. Throughout the history of the world, in all of its wars, what has been at stake has always been the same: land and property. The rebellion was soon drowned in blood, but Petleshkov managed to hide. The Ottoman Turks wanted him alive. They knew how to coerce the wealthy of Bratsigovo into betraying him. They set their houses on fire. The 31-year-old revolutionary was forced to give himself up. He was at the age when most men decide to accumulate property. Petleshkov had everything, but not freedom, and beyond it was destruction and ruin. They interrogated him between two fiercely burning fires. Petleshkov didn't betray any of his brothers in arms. His last words before he died of his wounds and the poison he had swallowed were, "I'm alone. There's no one else."
The course of time had turned back. Building traditions that had for so long contributed to solidarity between Bulgarians now ended up dividing them. Some of them had property, others didn't. Some would die for the chance to add one more story to their house, while their neighbour would die for freedom.
Their homes had made some of them into masters of the spirit, and others into common hostages. But history is clear about this. Only 2 years later, Bulgaria would be independent. The spirit of the Bratsigovo builders would flow together with the sunlight through the many windows of the churches they built. Like the flaming torches with which this dangerous journey began along the shores of Lake Kostor, the course of time had turned back to the future. Ancient Athens is again near Athens.